So today on Future Forward, we're looking forward.
We'll explore how a global health crisis is changing the way we look at a digital
We're
future.
joined by our friend Glenn from IEEE Spectrum,
I'm Alexis
and I'm Stephen
Scordato.
Rosenbaum. Let us launch. And this is we're bringing Glenn right up here at the top. So Glenn, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule on this crushed Saturday recording session.
Yes, yes, very busy indeed, sitting here in my apartment. Understood.
People who are busy, they're like doing sourdough starters and baking their faces off and playing Minecraft, Animal Crossing.
I have been baking. I baked a banana bread a couple days ago.
And by the way, I wanted to let you know that I appreciated that because that posting alone encouraged me to bake a banana bread.
Oh,
So
I actually baked a banana bread inspired by you, Steve.
See, there's a banana bread pandemic spreading through the internet. That's now, to be fair, I also did have a bowl full of soon-to-be rotten bananas that were speaking to me rather passionately. So,
There you go.
all right, so we're going to do this podcast in 3 chapters. Chapter 1 is going to be the power and peril of the internet. Chapter 2 is going to be treatments, what we're hearing these days, and chapter 3 we're going to look at the future. And Glenn, we brought you in for the whole show for 2 reasons. One, because a lot of the driving force behind this particular podcast comes from articles that we read on Spectrum, and also because I know that much people who are in the science and technology space, you're probably consuming this information at a greater rate than most other people, and hopefully one of the things I think that's very hard, and we'll get to it when maybe we just start with it, is you sit in front of the computer, all this information comes at you, it's very hard to know sources, what's accurate, what's relevant, and I wondered if you had any thoughts about how the internet ends up being a positive force in information without being a negative force in disinformation.
Well, I think all of us have to exercise prudence in our consumption of media. The publications and news outlets and journals and other things that have a good reputation for authority and reliability and good journalistic practice, the ones that had that reputation before this pandemic are going to be the ones that have it afterward. So, we all know about these marginal internet sites that promote, frankly, nonsense and garbage, and those are to be avoided now as much or more than ever.
So the Lancet had an article that we'll put in the show notes, and maybe this is a comment that's already been kicking around, but I'd never heard this phrase before, infodemic. And the Lancet is clearly a high quality, incredibly valuable, medical publication, and essentially what they were saying was, we're all potentially victims of this information epidemic of misinformation, misleading information, old, things that were accurate a week ago but aren't accurate today, checking the date of when things are published. Did you guys, I was actually surprised to see a medical publication talking about information as potentially an accelerator of the epidemic. I found that a little chilling.
Yeah, and it's usually not their lane, right, to comment in that way. But I mean, the only way we're actually going to get ahead, not get ahead of this, I guess, control it or respond, is to attack it from different ways. So in some ways, I'm not surprised. There was also I feel like I got random texts about taking Advil during this time, right? And I'm not sure what your exposure was to some of these remedies, but yeah, I think it's really important.
Yeah, there was something that there were a few videos that I saw that suggested that people who suspect they might have coronavirus should not take NSAIDs, which is non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs, and they include both aspirin and ibuprofen. So, I guess it's somewhat controversial, but there has been some responsible scholarship that suggests that ibuprofen, aspirin, and other NSAIDs are not a great idea. It's not like it's going to just send you into a spiraling, horrible condition, but some of the research on that is definitely legitimate.
Yeah, I think for me, what was interesting is just the flurry of text from actually different friends and family. And I was like, where did you read it? And they couldn't actually send me the link, right? So it was already like 4 degrees removed from the original source. And I actually think like that's why the infodemic notion here is so critical, because everyone is sort of relaying information in real time. It's almost like a virus itself, right? Virality, right? We talk about it in marketing. And so it's interesting to have viral content and viral information spread just as quickly as the disease itself. And so,
yeah,
this is a prime example of like an atmosphere in a situation that really heightens gossip and fear and rumor. It's like, it's like gasoline on a wildfire. It's in some ways it reminds me. I was an embedded reporter in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and I remember being in the green zone during times of tension and fear, and crazy rumors would fly around the green zone. And I think it happens anytime you have a group of people who are sort of in an enforced, isolated circumstance when there's, not a huge amount of information coming out to them, and they suspect that, their things are being withheld from them, either, whether they're suspecting that for good or bad reasons, or you seem to get this situation where crazy things fly around. Like I remember being in the green zone, and repeatedly you'd hear this rumor that some lions or tigers from the Baghdad Zoo were roaming around. Mm-hmm. And the third time you heard it, you would just roll your eyes. But it was that kind of thing, and it reminds me a little bit now of what's going on.
Yeah. So I'm curious to both of you, what media are you consuming right now? And are you actually making any concerted effort to kind of shut off a little bit?
Oh, that's a hard question. No, I mean, I'm look, one of the things that is hard is that a lot of these super kind of fake news sites have names that sound very much like real news sites. So you have to bookkeep in your head. The Washington Times, the Washington Insider, the Washington Post, which is the one that's the fake one, which is the one that's owned by Sung Young Moon, which is the one that Tucker Carlson, what wire, I can't, so I end up Googling them a lot. Like, I do follow a site that my wife thinks is irresponsibly extremist. There's a kind of a
okay.
There's a Trump tracking site called Palmer Report, and I don't take it as gospel, and it's often it's things that are rumors that may or may not be true as you find out more about them, but everything in flavors. I don't, did either of you read the thing in the Times about who's in charge at Fox News?
No, I didn't.
It was terrifying.
What's the TLDR on that?
No one.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the real answer was Lachlan is busy doing other things, and they've handed it to a lawyer who really doesn't know anything about the media business, and mostly the on-screen talent is just saying or doing whatever they want.
That's not necessarily surprising.
Yeah, I mean, but to be fair, the same could be true of CNBC or, who knows? But to get back to Alexa's question, I have been following fairly regularly the daily updates, video updates on YouTube of a person named John Campbell, Dr. John Campbell. So this guy is a PhD. He's not a medical doctor as far as I know, but he's a PhD. But he has had a whole career of training nurses in the United Kingdom. So that was what he did for most of his career. He did it all over the world. And he has what appears to me to be a very broad and wide knowledge of epidemiology and infectious diseases. And he's been doing a daily update on YouTube. It's very charming. It's actually filmed by his wife in his house. And I think it's terrific. I mean, I think it's an absolutely fantastic source of news and insights into what is going on all over the world. It's very international. So I've been trying to keep up with him. There are one or two other YouTube updates that I find good. But I have been allowing myself an hour of news a day in the morning. I will listen to an hour of news, from various sources. Often it's NPR, but then that's it. Then I turn off the news and I have either silence or I stream big band music from the 30s and 40s, or classical music, just something to keep things loose.
Let's talk about this article. I pulled it as one of the things I wanted to talk about with you, Glenn, for a particular reason. Here, let me just pull it up so everyone who's watching can see it. Where is it? There it is. Okay. So the headline is COVID-19 makes it clear that broadband access is a human right. And I was surprised by that article because of one word, which was the word clear, which struck me as, for you guys, a pretty strong thing to say, not in an op-ed voice, but in an editorial voice. And I actually agree with it for a whole variety of reasons we can talk about. But I thought there was some real thought leadership there that was it doesn't, if you Google it, it doesn't show up all over the internet. It's not like there's a consensus about this. And I'm curious as to editorially where that came from, and then also we can talk about the article itself, because I think it makes some points I had not read anywhere else.
Okay, yeah. Well, first I should start by saying that was a column. We have 4 regular columnists at IEEE Spectrum. That was written by Stacy Higginbotham, who's our internet columnist. So, maybe there wasn't the disclaimer didn't make it clear, but Stacy is a columnist, so it is her opinion. We're not speaking, as it's true of essentially anything you read in Spectrum, we're not speaking for the IEEE, but right. Stacy felt strongly about that, and I think she made a very nice, cogent argument that this current pandemic, this crisis, makes it clear how important broadband internet access for everyone, and it's not just a luxury to stream entertainment or play games, but it really is, in times of crisis like this, a lifeline. It enables people to continue working, whether they're students or workers. It provides access to vital information that people need to go about their lives in a safe and responsible way.
I'll tell you, just as a little bit of so I needed to get a prescription from CVS. Nothing life-threatening, but I just needed to pick it up. First of all, every way into CVS now derives you back to the website. There's no human answering the phone. You're not going to go to the pharmacy. You're not going to talk to your pharmacist, whoever that may be. Didn't know I had a pharmacist, but it turns out they think I do. But everything drives back to the CVS site, and then it's all AI driven. It's all automation. It's tell us your name, tell us your social security number, tell us your birth date. We found your file. We found your prescription. We're filing it. Do you want it? You never end up talking even if you do the voice response thing where you just say operator, operator, operator over and over again, it mostly says due to COVID-19, we're exceptionally long wait times, which I'm sure is true. But a lot of these companies that were already driving you to interact with them in some, augmented AI-driven, web-driven experience are now insisting on it.
Yeah, and this, another aspect of broadband is that I think what we're going to see as this pandemic plays out and as it drags out, people turning more and more to telemedicine. People consulting with doctors through their smartphones in real time using video and other tools where the doctors will be able to look at people and, using other tools that are available, get a view of this person that they couldn't without broadband.
Right. Although the terrifying thing is, given what I know they're going to ask you, I could do it too, which is hold an orange up to your nose. Can you smell it? Yes. Okay. You don't have COVID-19. It's do you have respiratory? I know two people whose doctors are positive they're COVID-19 positive, but they can't get tests because they don't have symptoms that trigger access to a test.
Right.
So yeah, telemedicine for sure. Although I also think there's a safety thing for the doctors, which is you'd way rather talk to patients over the phone or in video than have them come into your office.
Yeah. But to get back to your initial assertion, the fact is that rates of broadband penetration vary hugely in the world. And in some ways, it's what you'd expect. In developed countries, there's a lot greater broadband access than in lesser developed countries. However, there are surprises. The countries that have the absolute highest penetration, well, maybe it's not that much of a surprise, but they're Scandinavian countries and also Asian countries like Korea, Taiwan, and as I say, some of the Scandinavian countries have broadband penetration rates above 95%, whereas in the United States, it's in the 80s, I think. There's, as Stacy pointed out in her column, between 20 and 40 million people in the United States have no access to broadband. So
that's terrifying. I guess I didn't read. That's terrifying.
Yeah, but to be fair, the United States is a big country. So in a country like South Korea, it's not that hard technologically to provide broadband access to everybody. But the United States has, enormous, relatively empty areas, and providing broadband access in those areas, it's something this country has wrestled with for a long time. We've covered that in Spectrum, but it's very expensive to provide broadband to those people in very, very rural areas. We did this for electricity in the United States in the 1930s, and it was probably still going on in the 50s, but it was a huge effort. So it remains to be seen whether this pandemic, this crisis we're in, will help make this happen.
It was a big Warren platform, not big, but it was something that I think she said $85 billion in grants is what she proposed to address broadband in rural America.
Yeah, 85 million?
No, billion.
Okay, yeah, that sounds more like, sorry, yeah, $85 billion.
I was like, wow, that is a lot of money. And then when you look into it, you're like, oh, okay, the infrastructure in order to do it actually requires this investment.
So it should also be noticed in connection with this, noted that Elon Musk has this broadband from space plan. He's got this satellite vision, and this is something people have talked about for 25 years or more, which is, that's one of the advantages of satellite-based broadband, is that it doesn't matter if you're in the middle of Wyoming or if you're in New York City. It's, actually it's easier in that case to provide satellite broadband. And so, we could, something like that could see this happening, could speed up the timetable.
All right,
yeah, Facebook is also working on it too.
So let's move on to chapter 2, because chapter 2 is interesting. Chapter 2 is treatments, and I want to start with this Spectrum article about scientists using stem cells to treat COVID-19 patients in China. I should know this and I don't. So, does China have the same rigorous kind of medical test? One of the things I think that's a conflict in this country is, our current administration is kind of saying, well, why don't we just try a bunch of stuff and some people will die, but then we'll figure out what the problem is. And the medical community consistently across the board is saying, yeah, that's not how we do things. We come up with a protocol, we test it in a, there's like the idea that we're going to kind of throw out the window the rigorousness of medical testing in the U.S. is unacceptable. How is China ahead of us on the stem cell treatment? And is it because they're being looser around testing protocols, or just because they've had the problem longer than we have?
Yeah, well, there's no question that China's regimes for testing experimental drugs and treatments is more permissive than what you find in the United States or Western Europe, for sure. There's no question about that. One thing that you should understand is that one of the things that hangs over the U.S. experimental treatment community is this tragic death that occurred about 20 or 25 years ago or so. There was a young man who was part of a gene therapy trial at the University of Pennsylvania, and he volunteered to be part of this gene therapy test, and tragically he died. And it was a big surprise, and it was sort of it became a kind of a touchstone event that led to a lot of soul searching on the part of U.S. regulators and drug developers about the safety of experimental treatments and drugs. So now we find ourselves 20, 25 years later in this really tense crisis. And, there are a lot of things that might work. And one of them is stem cells. So there was this experiment. There was this experiment in China. It was a very small one, though, as it turns out, where they injected stem cells literally into the bloodstream of patients. The initial study was only 7 people, but according to the researchers, all 7 showed improvement. So that opened some people's eyes. But there's a lot that's not understood about this. And I've tried to read about the potential mechanisms and what happened. And basically, as near as I can tell, it's not fully understood. Basically, the stem cells are somewhat miraculous entities in the human body. These are cells that they're associated with fetuses, and what they have this amazing property, which is that they can turn into almost any other kind of cell in the body. So in terms of treatment, they have been of great interest for a long time. So in this Chinese study, stem cells were injected into the bloodstream of patients suffering from COVID-19. The stem cells through the bloodstream made their way to the lungs, because as you know, the respiratory system is the main scene of action for the COVID-19 illness. And once they were in the lungs, they apparently secreted anti-inflammatory agents of various types, including growth hormone, I think. And these patients showed an improvement. Now, I'm sure that's a greatly oversimplified explanation. There has been a lot of caution and even some kind of mild criticism of this experiment. It was very small, although the Chinese authorities are promising a much larger one. I don't know for sure, but I believe that it would be difficult to try an experiment that is as experimental as this one in the United States. But I'm not an expert on that area.
Yeah, but I think you're right. And it's been interesting. I probably consume more than an hour of news a day, and there's lots of news about spread in New York. There's lots of news about, Andrew Cuomo's daily conference and Trump's daily conference. There's very little about the status of medical trials. There's very little, and I think that's the media collectively not wanting to fill people's heads with kind of endless numbers of this might work, but this might work, in part because that's really dangerous, right? It cuts against the stay-at-home message in a terrible way.
I think it's a combination of things, because you have the New York Post periodically just touting vitamin C, it might work, and then when it turned out that hydroxychloroquine might have some sort of valuable anti-inflammatory properties, that went everywhere. So, I think that if there's some treatment story that can basically get eyeballs or sell newspapers, I think, there's a certain faction of the media that's interested. But, I think the places to go for responsible news about treatments or potential treatments and so on are places like you mentioned, the Lancet, also STAT, the publication STAT, which I think is doing a terrific job. But, there are places that I think are doing a good job with this.
And STAT we have coming up in a link. Actually, let's jump to the next article, which I thought was fascinating. The benefits and risks of contact tracing. When you follow, kind of the perception is that the way that you stop an outbreak is by essentially, finding out who everyone has seen or where everyone has been near, and then essentially, isolating them. Now that's somewhat gone away because I think as we've moved to a community spread, that's less relevant. But I also think, again, this gets back to China versus the U.S. It's easier for the Chinese government to say, we're just going to, since we track all of you anyway, we're just going to know where you're all going and we can follow the spread that way. And so I found this article about the dangers of contact tracing. In some ways, it's a place where, strangely, I do agree with some of the public sentiment, which is, be careful if the cure is worse than the disease, which is if we give away all our personal freedoms. I don't feel that way about home isolation, by the way. But, if the solution is the only way we're going to stop this is for everyone to put an app on their phone that tells the government where they are at all times, so that that's super creepy. And although Alexa's smiling because the answer is, of course, they already know all of that.
I'll admit, so I have been sort of social distancing and quarantining since the 9th. And so I want to say maybe 10 days in, I was like, I wish we were like Singapore. I would rather nip it in the bud and just like surrender. Let's get this under control. Let's just have like a national 2-week lockdown, like isolate, quarantine, trace, and then like let's move on. And so I actually was like, that's where I was, but I completely understand the danger and creepiness of it.
So there was
but to think about this, if someone came to you, some all-knowing genie, and said, hey, listen, you're going to have to use this app and it's going to be really invasive and intrusive, but 10 million people are going to be alive at the end of this who wouldn't be alive. These are people's grandmothers, parents, brothers and sisters. Okay, do you take that bargain? I say yes.
Yeah, and again, I was there. I said, you know what? I would rather surrender my data. I would rather lock myself in and have everyone do that so that it actually shortens the period of time. What's scary is we're choosing not to do this, right? We are not China. We are not Singapore. And I don't see a light at the end of the tunnel.
Right.
All right. So
but we should say contact tracing is a very, very big and vague term. So let's unpackage it. I mean, one of the things that this involves is, some of it involves your smartphone. So all of us in developed societies, we carry a smartphone. Smartphones have GPS hardware in them. That GPS hardware focuses whether you're using location or not. So one of the ways that experts are using this in some countries, and the countries we know of that are doing smartphone tracking include Israel, China, South Korea, I think maybe Taiwan, maybe Singapore, but some countries are on record doing this. So what happens is if a person tests positive for COVID-19, they can voluntarily or maybe involuntarily surrender their geolocation data from their smartphone. So the presumption is that they carry their phone. And then what you can do with that geolocation data is you can see where that person's been over the past however many days, and you can see where they came into close contact with other people. So you could see it can be cross-correlated with other people's geolocation data, and you could see where, for example, that person came within maybe a couple feet of someone on the street or in a shop or something else. So then that person can be notified that they may be at risk, these people who came into close contact with this person. Now, apparently it breaks down if the person has been on an airplane or in a very large gathering, because it overwhelms the system. But the utility has not been questioned. Just being able to know what you can know from tracing out this person's location data and how they impacted other people has, as far I understand it, been unquestionably of great use in some of these countries that have done a great job of countering the disease, such as South Korea. I mean,
right
after an initial rocky period. So, but there was an op-ed in the New York Times, I think yesterday, Friday, that I found to be rather naive and wishy-washy. This person was saying, well, we have to have lots of protections for privacy, which I agree. This can be done with third-party anonymity, anonymization, and so on to protect people's identity and privacy, and still use the useful data. However, as I recall, this op-ed writer said that the whole thing should be voluntary. In other words, if you're tested with COVID-19, then it should be totally up to you whether you participate in this or not, which I think is naive and silly. I mean, if you're going to use it to save lives and you have developed a system that protects people's privacy, then it should just be used.
So it's so interesting you say that, because it just makes me actually think about the what's happening right now with soon expecting parents, and how hospitals are saying that you can't have your partner in the delivery room. And so, right. I think there's one side where I can say, you know what, we shouldn't have a choice in this. We should let the medical community and scientists and the government actually just do what needs to get done. But then I can actually look at another sort of context, and I could not even fathom being in a scenario where if I were pregnant, expecting during this time, if I didn't have a choice to discuss with my partner if they were going to go to the hospital with me, I feel like I would lose my mind, right? So I feel so torn about what freedoms I'm willing to surrender and what choice I want to have.
I mean, it gets even worse than that, because right here on Long Island, one of the highest demographic parts of the United States, there was a breakout in a nursing home out on the east end of Long Island, and as I understand it, several of the people who died in that breakout, obviously quite elderly people, died alone because their loved ones could not be allowed into the room with them. So these are heartbreaking stories, and we as a society have to look at all of this in making decisions about what are our privacy privileges worth right now.
So now that we've gone to the depths of depression, I think we ought to come out the other side and look at a Stat News article about experimental drug treatments and when one might be ready.
But before we get to that, I just want to say there's one other thing, which is that the other piece of contact tracing here is facial recognition, which is where things get really interesting. This same op-ed in the New York Times alluded very kind of briefly to the use of facial recognition in Russia in connection with COVID-19. So the idea is that if you test positive for COVID-19 and you are now in a database. So if you are out on the street, law enforcement can recognize you using facial recognition and know that you have COVID-19 and you're out on the street and you shouldn't be. So, again, to me, this is really interesting because, a tool like this is obviously immensely powerful, but this is a whole nother step, I think, in privacy, and one that we all really have to think about.
Yeah. All right. So I'm getting to optimism now.
Switching gears to cures or antiviral medicines.
Yeah. So what I liked about this, and by the way, Glenn, hadn't heard of Stat News.
Yeah, it's a publication that was started by the Boston Globe about 2 years ago, I want to say, and it was started specifically to disseminate general interest news about medicine and biotechnology, and they have quickly acquired a following for their excellent journalism. They've hired some terrific journalists, and they're really coming into their own during this pandemic.
So in reading this, I took away two executive summary headlines. One was, there will be treatment and there will be a cure. And the second was, it ain't going to happen soon enough.
Right. So the cure is going to be a vaccine. And, there's already been experimental trials of vaccines in the United States and Europe and in China. So there's unquestionably going to be a vaccine, but vaccines take time. There have to be multiple trials, and vaccines work. They're not 100%. Many of us have had an experience where you get a flu shot and you nevertheless get flu, but they work pretty darn well, and they create something called herd immunity, where they reduce the incidence of an illness such as a viral infection, an outbreak of a viral infection, to such a low level that it's not a problem. So no one doubts that that's going to happen, but it's not going to happen in 2020. It's almost certainly going to happen in 2021. So the next question is, well, what do we have until then? And the other thing are drugs that have a record of effectiveness in treating viral illnesses. And a viral illness is difficult to treat. It's very difficult to treat. A bacterial illness, we have an enormous assortment of antibiotics that we've had for decades, and there are literally hundreds, if not thousands of them. And so, although we've got antibacterial resistant strains of illnesses now proliferating in the world, still, for most bacterial-based illnesses, there are effective drugs. We don't have that with viral illnesses. People have been working on antivirals for decades. Many people have had some experience with an antiviral called Tamiflu, which was developed to treat influenza 20 or 25 years ago. And it's okay. I mean, I had tried it many years ago, and I think it helped me a little bit, but we don't yet have terrific options for treating viral illnesses. And that's what this pandemic is going to focus a lot of attention on. It's already happening.
So the last thing I just want to share as we kind of get to the end of our time is there's been some extraordinary work going on in New York with very, very fast university-based production of personal medical protective gear, in which at least 3 labs that I'm aware of at NYU are now producing N95 capable masks using 3D printing, and in conjunction with NYU Langone. There is below the surface all this pent up energy around building new solutions. I've been puzzled by kind of what's going on at the government level with, for example, ventilators. We're talking about getting GM bucket of money to build ventilators. But as I Googled it last night, there are like 8 companies in the US that already manufacture them at scale. So why we wouldn't give the money to them to make their factories work round the clock or get bigger or add more gear, as opposed to GM learning how to build a ventilator from the ground up, seems to me more political than medical.
Well, to be fair, I believe that GM is in an alliance with General Electric, which, you know, GE has an enormous health business, has had one for many, many, many years, and GE is a major player in ventilators already. So I think the idea there was to, you know, combine GE's expertise and existing designs and engineering with GM's fantastically large manufacturing capability. My understanding also basically is that we need a very large number of ventilators very quickly. So it could be that the smaller players do very well at, you know, making a certain set number of ventilators and simply don't have the manufacturing resources to step that up, say, tenfold or fold in the next few weeks, which is what we need.
All right. Well, we are out of time. This has been very informative and interesting, and we're all well read in different ways. So, you know, standard. What is it now? The standard goodbye on all Zoom conference calls is like wash your hands, right? I mean, wash your hands, wear a mask.
20 seconds. 20 seconds.
20 seconds. I know that's a. You have to sing Happy Birthday twice?
Yep. That's the rule.
All right. See you guys in a week. Stay safe.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Alexa.